Alright, this is the second segment for the Intro to World War II. We pick up with appeasement and isolationism. A little bit more about the appeasement that was a policy that was followed by both the British and the French. The French, of course, built the Maginot Line to protect themselves against future German incursions. This turns out to be a huge failure because warfare has changed by that point. The British, of course, are fearful, just as the French are, of World War I being repeated, and in fact most of the politicians in the interwar years pledged never to allow that to occur again. So beyond the fact that they just didn't want to go to war, there was a huge fear that they would recreate World War I, and that's part of what Hitler takes advantage of as he continually expands, takes more territory, and violates all the rules that he was supposed to follow. Now, U.S. isolationism, there was no question that as the war clouds began to brew in Europe, there were people in the U.S. who were warning about the trouble, but including Roosevelt, who really did see Hitler as a threat even before the war actually began. But the truth is that the U.S. did not want to get into the war as a people, and this was illustrated by a group called the America First group, who were the leaders of the isolationist sentiment. But Republicans in general tended to be more isolationistic than the Democrats did, but the Democrats were very much influenced by the fact that many of their supporters also just did not want to get involved. So Hitler actually, as we said, takes power in 1933. He'll begin to do all kinds of things to violate the rules, including taking Austria in 1938 after taking over some land that had been given to the French earlier that was supposed to be sort of neutral. And in March of 1939, there's the huge crisis at the Munich conference, where the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain will travel to Munich along with the French Minister Daladier, or French President Daladier, and of course Mussolini, who was the original fascist, is there with Hitler. And what they decide to do is to give Germany half of Czechoslovakia. Now, Hitler's basic move to do all this was to claim that there were people in a particular area who were actually German, who were being mistreated, and he was just protecting them. This will actually be the rationale that they'll give for their attack on Poland, the one that will actually start World War II. But following the agreement in 1938, Chamberlain returns to London and he says we have peace in our time, because Hitler had signed a document saying he would not actually attack anyone or use war as an instrument of policy, and that he was done with his expansionism. But of course, that's not the case, and so in September of 1939, Germany invades Poland, and the French and the British at that point had said, if you do this, then it will end up starting a war, and they do declare war. Now, immediately the United States declares itself to be neutral. However, we do begin the process of attempting at least to somewhat begin getting ready for war. So let's talk a little bit about the erosion of American neutrality. Don't forget that at the same time that Hitler invaded Poland from the west, Stalin, who Hitler had made an agreement with right before the war began, invaded Poland from the east. So Stalin, not only did he kill more people than Hitler ever thought about killing, but he was also part of the bad guys at the beginning of the war. But of course, when he flips sides or changes his view once Germany attacks him on June 22nd, 1941, then we become allies with Stalin throughout World War II, which is interesting because it leads to the issue of the Cold War that will follow. Alright, so let's take a look at the erosion of American neutrality. The U.S., seeing things that were going on in Europe, Congress passed and the President signed neutrality laws in 35, 36, and 39 that specifically forbade us to trade or have anything to do with warring powers, and that we must be neutral. Now, in order to protect from what had happened in the past, and that was Americans selling products to Europe and having our ships be sunk, and then having to get in on the war in order to make sure our ships are protected, the original policy the U.S. had until until after the war had actually begun was something called cash and carry. Now, the Neutrality Acts pushed this, and it was the idea that if anybody wanted to buy our war goods, or any goods from us for that matter during wartime, any combatants, they had to bring their ship to our port and pay us in cash. Now, it's interesting, they're not going to pay you in American bills probably, but they're going to pay you in something that you don't have to rely upon that nation surviving in order to make good. So either gold or silver or cash. Now, in response to the beginning of World War II, in September of 1939, the U.S., as you see here, passes its first ever peacetime draft by a single vote. So World War II was already raging in Europe, and we barely get the draft voted into existence by a single vote. And it was a tough vote to get, and although Roosevelt was very much for it, he wanted to get us ready. After taking over Poland, France falls to Hitler in 6 weeks using the Blitzkrieg military tactic and strategy, which combined quick tanks and cannons and also air power all at the same time. It was a very different war than what had been fought in World War I in the trenches. It was a very mobile war, which was a big change. Part of the reason the Germans were able to defeat different nations they ran against pretty easily was that they were the first to adopt all of this. France itself fell within 6 weeks, and that put a lot of scare in the United States. In fact, it wasn't long after France had fallen that Americans claimed that they saw German parachutes coming from the sky at New York and New Jersey. Of course, that didn't happen, but it showed that we were becoming fearful at that point. At this point, what happens in the European war is the Battle of Britain, and this is Hitler bombing Great Britain. This is something that was reported every moment and heard every moment by the American people through shortwave radio. Broadcasters for NBC, ABC, well, I don't think ABC was around, but NBC and CBS broadcast from London, and you could hear the falling of the bombs, described all the horror of the bombing campaigns themselves, and that was the Battle of Britain. Now, at that point, Roosevelt was beginning to make some noise about trying to help the British. Churchill was very much trying to convince Roosevelt to get involved in the war, and that takes us to the election of 1940. Roosevelt runs for an unprecedented third term, but he delayed his announcement of his candidacy until the last minute, knowing that going for a third term would violate Washington's previous limitation, and knowing a lot of people would be a little unhappy with him, especially those who disliked him, that he would run again. But his comment was one should not change horses in midstream, and that he could see the war clouds on the horizon. But with war clouds on the horizon, Roosevelt claimed that if he's elected, American boys will not shed blood on foreign soil. Now, what's kind of interesting about that is that his opponent in the election of 1940, Wendell Willkie, also ran on a peace platform. And he stated that FDR was not really telling the truth. He said, on the basis of Roosevelt's past performance with pledges he's given to the American people, if you re-elect him, you may expect to be at war by April of 1941. Well, Willkie was a little bit off because it happens in December. But Roosevelt doesn't win by a gigantic plurality. He does win, as you can see, the electoral votes pretty well, but the election was actually relatively close, and again, he was breaking a precedent that had never been set before by running for and then eventually succeeding and gaining his third term. He got his votes again from the Roosevelt coalition that we had talked about before. All right, this leads us to the Lend-Lease situation. Congress, Roosevelt had asked, well, let's back up a little bit. The British were the only ones that were really fighting the Germans at this point. The Germans had yet to invade the Soviet Union, and so the only nation that was holding out were the British, and they were having a hard time as the bombing campaign continued and all the difficulties that went along with that. They also were beginning to have a hard time raising the funds to buy our products and to come get them, for that matter. And so Churchill was pushing very hard to get Roosevelt to change our neutrality laws, or at least change our trading pattern. And Roosevelt wanted to help them too. His view was, if the British can stop the Germans, then perhaps we won't have to. So he proposed to Congress something called Lend-Lease, and That's the idea that if Congress would allow it, he would sign a bill that would allow nations like the British to not have to pay cash for their stuff, and that we would lend it to them or lease it to them. Now, this is a huge step, because if you lend or lease something to someone and you expect to get it back, or at least be paid back for it, they have to survive, which would mean, of course, that we would probably have to get into the war and help the British to survive. Well, the election, or the vote for this, was coming up in Congress, and it looked very, very, very close. In fact, there were pundits who were predicting that it would not pass. And it was at this point that Roosevelt gave one of his most famous fireside chats. We've talked a little about those before, about how he used the media like no one else, made people actually understand what he was doing and talk to them directly, which no president had done before. But in this case, he told an interesting story that history recalls as the garden hose analogy. And in this story, he talked about someone who lived in a neighborhood who was sleeping, and probably around 2 or 3 a.m. there was a loud knocking on their door. They ran down to the door, opened the door, and there was their neighbor. And their neighbor said, "My house is on fire. It's not a very big fire right now, but I can't put it out because I have no garden hose. If I just had a hose, I could put it out, just connect it to my water spigot, and then it would be easy to take care of. May I borrow your garden hose?" Well, Roosevelt said that what the neighbor needed to do was to go ahead and lend him the garden hose so that the neighbor could put out the fire, so that it wouldn't spread to the house of the person in the story. And he said this analogy was very similar to why we needed to lend stuff to the British, so that they can stop the Germans where they are and that the problem doesn't spread to the United States. Well, this fireside chat made just enough difference so that Lend-Lease was passed, and that's going to occur in early 1941. And as you see here, as isolationists had predicted, the U.S. begins to, we begin to allow the British to just to be lent our equipment, and they don't have to pay for it. It's being sunk by German U-boats, and so as you see here, as isolations had predicted. And by the way, their prediction immediately after the vote on Lend-Lease was not if we would end up in war with Germany, just when was the only question. So to protect our stuff, we begin to send our Navy out for a protection zone for shipments going to Britain. Incidents occur between German U-boats and American naval vessels, and you see the build-up again as the German U-boats attack American shipping, just as we saw in World War I. So it seems as though events will push the U.S. into war with the Germans as outrage begins to grow in the United States about the incidents at sea as we try to protect our stuff that's being loaned to the British. But before the U.S. can become angry enough to declare war on Germany, the Japanese, Germany's ally, will attack Pearl Harbor on the other side of the world on December 7th, 1941. And you see here the image of the iconic American battleship, the USS Arizona, that exploded as a result of the attack, killing 1,200 U.S. sailors, most of whom are still entombed in the ship itself, which is in the at Pearl Harbor today as a memorial. They just left the ship there as a memorial and a grave for those who had died. So now we have to deal with the rise of Japan, and the short version is that the Japanese were actually on the side of the Allies in World War I. Were part of the victorious side, were part of the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles. And during the 20s, the Japanese actually began to fully embrace Western ideas, to the extent that they had Japanese jazz, Japanese flappers. They were opening up their culture. They were becoming much more like a Western nation than an Eastern nation. But the response, they will get hit with the Depression just as everyone else does. Now, their response is to blame it all on the decadence of Western ideals. And so what they needed to do, in the view of many Japanese, was to go back to their basic roots, which of course the old samurai code, because the nation had been run by the samurai in the long distant past, and then the Bushido code of militarism and fascism. And so what we'll see is that this will lead them to try to expand and run into the United States, and we'll pick up with that in the next segment.